Welcome to Kitchen Table Finance, the podcast where we serve up bite-sized pieces of financial advice to simplify your money and your life. Join your hosts, David Shotwell and Nick Nauta, and let's get started.
Hey, Dave. How you doing today?
I'm doing great, Nick. How are you?
Fan-flippin-tastic.
Yeah.
Summer is coming to an end, and we are talking about tax stuff today.
Much too soon unless you're a parent of school-age children. Yeah. And then it's probably just on time. You can probably speak more to that than I can right now.
Indeed. So, as the parent of an incoming ninth grader, I am ready for him to go back.
Yes.
How he's going to get up before 2 p.m. is beyond me, but I guess that's his problem.
That's between him and his teachers.
Anyways, so today's topic, Dave, is Roth conversions for MSU, Michigan State University staff.
Yes.
And so there's some special little twerks and quirks that you can think about. But I think the big thing and why this is such an important topic is if you think about MSU employees, especially if you have been a Michigan State employee for a long time, up until this year, actually, your only choice for retirement plan contributions were in the pre-tax 403B or the pre-tax 457 plan, which means if you were an employee for 30 years and you're putting in your 5% and MSU is matching 10%, or if you're doing more than that, chances are you've got a substantial amount of pre-tax dollars in your retirement plan.
Yeah. You've got a combination of a very generous company match, university match, pretty substantial personal matches. And then, one of the longest and best bull market runs in history.
That certainly helps.
With a few pauses in between, but it's been a pretty good 20, 30 years here. So,
and because of that, depending on where your income range is, you may or may not have been able to make Roth contributions in addition to that along the way.
Exactly.
So you might be in a situation where all of your retirement money is in pre-tax dollars. Now, this is not necessarily the worst thing to happen in the world, but it does give us some pause when we start talking about tax planning. And this is where the topic of Roth conversions come into play. So you want to let our listeners know what a Roth conversion is, Dave?
So a Roth conversion is essentially taking pre-tax retirement dollars, paying tax on them now to move them into Roth retirement dollars, which then grow tax-free for the rest of your life.
Yeah. So many of our listeners may be questioning, why would I want to pay taxes now?
Well, why would you want to pay taxes now? To take advantage of potentially lower income now and lower tax situations now or in the near future compared to potentially higher taxes down the road. And what complicates that is that pre-tax retirement dollars, when you get into your early 70s, are going to be subject to required minimum distributions, which are based on your account value. So kind of back where we started, if you've been a diligent, good saver into the Michigan State plan with all of those dollars going into pre-tax savings, and then you've invested wisely and seen that grow, those required minimum distributions may end up being substantial. Yeah. I don't want to scare people. We're talking, 3.5, close to, I like to use 4%. It's a nice round number. People, it's a little less than that in your first year right now. But if you've built that plan up well, and where it really comes into play is when people don't necessarily need more income from the plan than what their required minimum distribution forces them to take.
Yep. So, in the media, and one of my favorites, Ed Slott, is famous for calling it a tax torpedo, which I think is a little bit overkill. But, his goal is to get people to tune in and listen and buy what he's selling. Great resource, by the way.
Yeah.
All things aside. But
very good, smart things to say, but it's very clickbait. The way he's put it out there.
So
lately.
I wouldn't go as far as tax torpedoes, but certainly something that if you're entering retirement, you want to think about, because there is generally this window of time before you have to start taking required minimum distributions.
Yes.
Yet after you retire, which may be very favorable in terms of how much income that you actually have, which means that your taxes might be much lower. And so one of the first kind of rules of tax planning is figuring out, when are you going to pay the most taxes? And the easiest part of that equation is, what taxes are you going to pay this year now, right? Because we know a lot of those factors. The harder part is projecting what your future taxes are going to look like. And that's where projecting out IRA balances and future RMDs come into play. And like you said, at 73 or 75, depending on when you start now, it's generally pretty minimal, but the older you get, the higher that ramps up. And if you're making more than what you're taking out, it kind of compounds the issue and we start getting larger and larger dollars. So we'll talk a little bit more about kind of some of those tax torpedo things, but just in general terms with a Roth conversion, there's a couple different types. The one that I would focus most on for Michigan State is IRA-to-Roth IRA conversions. Because most likely that's going to be your only real option, which does start to, bring up the conversation of, when you retire, should you roll money into an IRA? And this is one reason where you may want to roll, and you don't have to roll everything, but some of it, so you can do some conversions.
And so unfortunately,
go ahead.
I was going to say that I was just going to point out the difference that some employer plans allow you to do conversions within the 401k or 403b. Michigan State does not allow that. They allow Roth contributions now, but you cannot take your pre-tax money in the plan and move it into Roth.
Right. Yep. So that's kind of a little logistical thing for our Michigan State folks that you'll have to think about. The other type of Roth conversion would be what we would consider a backdoor Roth IRA. And so this is more useful for our folks who are probably still working and make more money than you can in order to make a direct Roth contribution. And so kind of the general gist of it, we won't go into too many of the details, but anyone can make a after-tax contribution to their traditional IRA. And there is no income limits, so anyone can convert. And so essentially the logistics of that are, you make an after-tax contribution to your IRA, you turn around and convert it to a Roth IRA, and voila, you have essentially made a Roth IRA contribution for the year. So check with your local CPA, because there are some rules and restrictions and things you want to think about.
Yeah, there are. Definitely, you need to be careful about what mix of retirement accounts you have outside of employer plans before you do this. There's some accounting rules you need to follow. So,
but the most important one, especially for our folks from the university who are retiring, is that IRA to Roth IRA conversion.
Right.
So with that, Dave, let's talk a little bit about, we know we talked a little bit earlier about kind of why it may make sense to do a conversion, especially after you retire, before you start taking required minimum distributions. But there's a couple of things that people aren't aware of when it comes to taxes. So the first one on my list of why a Roth conversion might be beneficial for you is the taxation of your Social Security. The more money you make, the higher percentage of your Social Security that is actually taxable to you, all the way up to 85% of that benefit. So you can pay as little as no tax on your Social Security and as much as taxes on 85% of it at your current income tax rates. And so that's where, depending on where you're at, if you have these larger required minimum distributions, it could potentially cause more of your Social Security to be taxable, where if you potentially converted some of that earlier on, you wouldn't maybe necessarily have that. Now, I will tell you that there's not a lot of folks that I know that are retired that are getting around paying taxes on Social Security, because that is not necessarily a lot of income. And so that's one that I don't worry too much about in general terms, but certainly something to kind of be aware of depending on where you fall on that spectrum.
Yeah, it's been increasingly rare to have somebody who's not paying tax on most, if not all, of the 85% of their Social Security. Then the other thing is, like, one of my least favorite topics in financial planning is the dreaded what we call the IRMAA brackets, which is the Medicare Part B income based premiums. And you do need to be aware of those.
Yeah. So what Dave's getting at there is everybody obviously qualifies not everybody, but most people qualify at 65 for Medicare. And everybody gets a set premium. However, same insurance coverage. If your income is higher, you may pay more for that premium. Depends. So it's income based. And so if you have those larger RMDs that push you up, it may cause you to end up paying IRMAA, which can be anywhere from $1,000-ish to a couple $1,000s extra every year that you pay in premiums, depending on what your income is. And so that's another one of those things where before 65, you may want to pay attention to doing some conversions. Although you have to be somewhat careful because it is a 2-year look back. So really 63.
Yeah.
So some things to think about and consider there.
I was going to point out with both of these, with both Social Security and the IRMAA, it's not only a factor in deciding if a Roth conversion makes sense because you'll face them during RMD time, but if you're already on Social Security or on Medicare when you're making the conversions, you have to be aware of it at that point too, because the conversion itself can trigger those taxes.
Right.
So.
Yep. So those are some considerations. IRMAA, again, there are use cases that we run in where it actually makes sense for people to pay a little bit extra IRMAA for a couple of years to do those conversions because it's going to avoid much bigger problems in the future. So it's not like a cut and dry, hey, don't ever go over the IRMAA limit. But certainly that's when the planning out of like what your future RMDs and tax rates are going to look like compared to where you're at today.
It used to be almost nobody that we talked to outside of the industry, no clients that we talked to were aware of IRMAA. And just in the last 2 weeks, I've had people come to me with questions about it, which I find interesting. But also to people, when they are aware of it, I think they tend to make more of it. To your point about it's not that we always avoid paying these, it's that we need to account for them in the math on whether a conversion makes sense.
Right.
Because it may make sense to go ahead and pay those, especially if it's just for a year or two. If doing a conversion means, hey, you're not paying them all through your 70s and 80s or all through required minimum distribution per job.
Yeah, for sure. So you can start to see there's a lot of math that goes into these calculations. But, I guess the biggest thing is don't sleep on conversions and start thinking about it, because the longer you wait, potentially the less chance you have to avoid some of these things in the future.
And that's happened with prospective clients a few times where they'll come in to engage with a financial planner for the first time the year before required minimums start and ask what they can do about it. And it's always a little bit frustrating to look back and see that if they had started proactively doing they retired at 64 and they've had almost no taxable income for 7 years. And, there was something that could be done, and now that ship has sailed.
Yeah, we both kind of run in that, and it's kind of one of those makes your stomach turn a little bit from the standpoint of you have a window every year of filling up lower tax brackets, and every year that you wait and don't do that is a lost year because you can't go back and say, hey, I'd like to do a conversion back in 2020. That ship has sailed after the end of the year. And so making sure you're paying attention to where you're at and what the future looks like. And even if you're still working to some degree, depending on where you're at, we've seen it make sense. I've got a couple people right now where we're doing some smaller conversions while they're still working, just because of where they're going to end up in the future. And then the other thing to say about that too is, it is kind of a hedge as well. We're in historically low tax brackets. And so if you're worried about tax brackets going up in the future, which seems like a pretty likely thing at some point, who knows for sure. And I'm not saying that, hey, taxes are going to go up in the future, so you should convert every dollar now at the lower rates. What I'm saying is, if you want to hedge against that, doing some conversions now at what are historically low tax
locking
brackets
in
probably makes things better if tax brackets go up in the future. I don't see necessarily how they go down for most people.
Yeah. I've had that conversation a few times over the last few years, and it's hard to see tax brackets themselves going lower. At the same time, I have a hard time believing that Congress is going to put it on, middle-class retirees to bear the burden of that.
Yeah.
But bottom line is, if all things being equal, we would expect taxes aren't going to go down. We would expect they're going to go up.
Right. Yeah. And in most of these, especially when we're running scenarios, most of the time it makes sense even if they don't go up. But it just, kind of compounds a little bit if they do end up going up in the future. Right. But to your point, Dave, and we've seen this a lot, especially in the state of Michigan and some of the other states around this movement of we don't want to tax retirees. Which politically seems to make a lot of sense to me because they tend to vote a lot.
They tend to vote as a block. Yeah.
But that aside, I think there is this kind of movement of we need to kind of take it easy on our retirees. And I don't see that being like hugely impacted by Congress one day where they just turn around and say, we're going to hammer retirees. And so that's something of note as well. Like sometimes in the media, you hear these stories about how high taxes are going to be in the future and, get everything converted now kind of thing. And I just don't see there being a drastic difference in tax rates for retirees.
I look at that again, kind of like Mr. Slott's headlines. That's advisors trying to get people in the door and excited about something that maybe doesn't warrant the, level of excitement that they're attaching to it.
Yes.
To put it nicely.
So another thing, we'll only touch briefly on this because we don't really, and Michigan isn't in one of these states, but there is several states who have state estate taxes. And the idea there is if the estate tax is at $1 million and I've got a $1.2 million pre-tax IRA, if I did some conversions and now I have a $900,000 Roth IRA because I paid the taxes, we kind of get around that idea of the estate tax.
Yeah, which is really
so something to consider if you're in one of those states that has an estate tax or an inheritance tax.
Yeah.
The other one on our list here is what you hear it a lot is called the widow or the widower's penalty, which is if you're a married couple, you have a completely different tax bracket than if you are a widow. And so what happens there is generally you inherit your spouse's IRA. And so what was one distribution or what was two potential RMDs in a higher tax bracket is the same RMD, but you're in a much more consolidated single filer tax bracket, which means you're going to end up paying more in taxes on those RMDs. And so it kind of compounds the problem of taking larger RMDs. So it's just another thing to think about, especially for our couples who maybe have an age gap in there, right? That's a little bit easier. Obviously, we can't, plan and decide, and our crystal balls don't tell us when people are going to die. But if there's an age gap, especially, if your spouse is, 5-10 years older than you, it's something to consider of how that all is going to fall down and trickle through. And then for early retirees, one of the hard parts, if you retire before 59 and a half is there is some issues with the 10% penalty. Now, the good news is conversions aren't subject to the 10% penalty for early withdrawal. But if you pay the taxes out of the conversion, that would be subject to the 10%. Yes. But the other thing to think about is if you are going to retire early, you do have better access to Roth funds than you do to pre-tax funds. So that's another thing to consider when you're thinking through, does this make sense to me? Should I be doing some conversions?
Yes.
So I think we've laid out some pretty good ideas around why this is potentially important and some of the things to think about and that go into the math of these conversations. But I wanted to spend a little bit of time at least on some of the conversion rules, Dave. So, and I think we talked a little bit about it already, actually, but technically anyone can make a Roth conversion. So there's no income limitations, which is very different than Roth contributions, right?
Yes. There's no income limit. It's not capped. Doesn't matter what you make. And also it doesn't matter, like you can't make a Roth conversion if you don't have earned income. And there's no income need requirement for making a conversion. You can have 0, you can have 100,000, you can have 500,000. You're still eligible to do a Roth conversion. So, you don't have to worry about that.
Yeah, the other thing, and we touched on it briefly, and for most of our Michigan State folks, this doesn't come into play, but I certainly wouldn't want to not mention it, and that is the pro rata rules.
Oh, yeah.
And so if you have any after-tax funds in a IRA, for example, even if you have multiple IRAs, they assume that those IRAs are one when it comes to converting, which means that if you're doing something like a backdoor Roth IRA, hoping to convert all of the after-tax money, but you have another IRA sitting out there that's all pre-tax,
Yes.
They're not going to let you just focus on the money that you don't have to pay taxes on. They're going to do it pro rata. And so it's just something to watch out for. Like I said, not a lot of people that we run across, especially Michigan State employees, generally have these after-tax type contributions sitting in IRAs. But it's certainly
rare.
something that you have to be careful of if you do fall into that.
Yeah.
So certainly something to consider there. So kind of going down into, and we talked a lot about it, but just thinking about factors to consider as does this make sense to me, right? Mm-hmm. And the first one, and probably the most important, is what is your current tax rate versus what your future tax rates are. And so, in general, if you're getting towards retirement, getting up there in years, chances are those are what we would call your peak earning years. And generally that means that you're more than likely in a higher tax bracket than you might be in retirement. But again, depending on the size of your IRAs, what the future growth is, and what those RMDs might be, maybe not. And so really kind of taking a deep dive and working with someone to help you project what those required minimum distributions will be in the future is going to be super helpful, because that's, one of the biggest factors. The goal of tax planning is to play the lowest average rate.
Yes, that's where I was going. And which traditionally tax practitioners, tax filers have focused on how do I reduce taxes this year and pay the least amount we can this year. And really what we want to do is back up and say, okay, but I want to look at the next 30 years and pay the lowest average I can over that time. And it's a little different mindset.
Yeah. One of the other things that has prompted a lot of these conversations as well, Dave, is the changes in some of the rules for non-spouse beneficiaries who inherit these pre-tax retirement accounts.
Yes.
And so you used to be able to do a stretch IRA, which meant that as an inherited IRA account holder, you usually had the ability to stretch those required minimum distributions over your lifetime. And now that is something reserved for spouses and a few other people. There's a few minor exceptions, but for most of us, we have this 10-year window where we have to take all of that money out over 10 years.
Right.
And it is the same rules for the Roth IRA, with the caveat that the Roth IRA isn't taxable to you. And so we have this, I call it a problem, but I always tell people, anybody that wants to give me IRA money upon their death, I will happily take it and pay the taxes on it. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't ignore the fact that a lot of people are inheriting these when they're in their peak earning years, right? And so if you're a parent, you've got a couple kids that you want to give your IRA to when you pass away, they're more than likely, depending on when you pass away, but they're usually towards their later career and making a lot of money. And now they have this consolidated 10-year window to take out, a large amount of money every year and pay a lot of taxes on it. And so it's kind of that same arbitrage of, if you took it out and converted it, if you're converting at, a lower rate than what your heirs will inherit it at, that may be something that you want to consider, especially if it is one of your, goals to pass on a legacy of some sort. Right. Like if you're going to give it all to charity, that's a completely different conversation, because charity is not going to pay taxes either way.
Yeah.
There is also, and so, to some degree, and this has come up a couple of times as well, especially for some of our single or our families who don't necessarily have kids, and it is going to go to potentially to charity. That doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't do Roth conversions, because it does provide potentially some flexibility in the future. It's nice. We always like it, Dave, when there's kind of 3 different tax buckets that we usually talk about, right? There's our pre-tax retirement funds, there's our Roth funds, and then there's also our, taxable brokerage savings account that you've already paid taxes on. You generally pay minimal taxes after. That gives us as advisors a lot of options when it comes to where you take money out of, and a lot of flexibility. And so, I always love it when people come with a good chunk of each of those, because it makes my job easy. But that's not to say we can't get to that. But that's another one of those where people make some Roth conversions just so they have some flexibility in the future of, if they needed to take a large lump sum for something that wouldn't necessarily screw up their taxes. You want to talk a little bit about outside funds and paying the taxes on conversions?
Sure. Well, if we just think about in terms of what's your tax budget for the year, which is usually where we start to figure out how much we can convert in a given year, we look at how much room you have before you hit certain tax points, inflection points in the brackets and IRMAA brackets where it no longer makes sense. So say we come up with that tax budget. Mathematically, you're better off if all of that money goes into the Roth conversion and you pay the taxes that are due from another source, say after-tax savings. We can always withhold on a conversion, but the tax budget remains the same. So let's say we determine you can take $50,000 out of your IRA before you hit where we would no longer think it mathematically makes sense, the next tax bracket. If you then do the conversion from that, you're only going to see, say, 40,000. If you do the withholding from that, you're only going to see, say, 40,000, the net amount, go into the Roth to grow tax-free. So we always like it, and it makes the math work better and makes the Roth more conducive down the road if you can pay those taxes from another source. It's not the be all and end all. I've had people pay the taxes from the conversion during the conversion, but that's definitely one of the benefits that you can have.
For sure. Yeah, and that kind of the whole goal of a lot of this is to get as much money in that
into
tax-free growth as you can. And so paying the taxes from an outside sources just helps that. Yeah. But like you said, not the end all be all. Couple of rules to consider before we get, there's, as with anything, we've made it sound like it's a no-brainer and everybody should do it, but there are some things to think about, right? And it isn't right for everybody. One of the biggest things with Roth conversions is irrevocability, which means that if I make a conversion in January of this year, I can't turn around in June and say, hey, I don't want to do that. Can I scratch that? Can we go back? Once it is done, which is one of the reasons why a lot of our conversions are done towards the end of the year, because the last thing that you want is to have some sort of big tax windfall or need to take some big distribution out that you didn't know about, and we've already done the conversion, and then all of the math and the planning kind of goes out the window.
Right. And the complicating factor with Roth conversions is they do have to be done by December 31st of the year. And what happens then in January and February, that's when we find out what your actual tax picture looks like, because that's when your 1099s from interest and your W-2s, all that stuff doesn't arrive until February. And then we can look back and say, oh, did we get the Roth conversion amount right?
Right.
So you do have to be kind of careful. We usually build in a margin of error based on the client situation, or make sure that if we overshot, it's not going to be, catastrophic. Usually with marginal tax brackets, it's not a big deal. With the IRMAA brackets, because those are cliffs, that's a little bit more important to stay.
Yeah, that's a great point. Like you said, some of those things are cliffs, like the IRMAA bracket. It's not the end of the world if you were trying to fill up the 12% tax bracket and you went a little bit over. It's just
the part that's over is going to pay
whatever's
a
over.
Little more. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's one thing that a lot of people don't understand about the tax code is it isn't, if I hit a certain income, everything's taxed at the next tax bracket. It's whatever is over that amount. And so it generally ends up being pretty minimal. But like you said, there are some things that are cliffs that you got to be sure on, or, build a little bit more of a buffer in there, if you will. So,
yeah.
And then obviously there's also different varying state tax rules. Conversion income may or may not be exempt depending on when you take it. Michigan's going through and doing a lot of changes to their retirement state tax, like we alluded to. Shout out to the future. There will be an episode on the retirement state tax for the state of Michigan coming up here. Hopefully relatively soon, because I know a lot of people are, kind of that's been changing for a while. And now that everything's all phased in, we have a better understanding of what that looks like. And every state takes these a little bit differently. And so making sure, you understand what your state tax rules are. Generally, most state taxes aren't like the biggest problem in the world. The state of Michigan's 4.25%. It's generally not changing a lot of our decision making. It's more about, can we save 10 to 15% on federal taxes? Paying 4.25% to do that is usually worth it on those types of things, but certainly something that you don't want to ignore, especially if you're in one of those higher tax states.
Right.
So, well, with that, Dave, hopefully we've gotten people excited, but not too excited about Roth conversions.
Excited enough to think about it and make sure it makes sense. Yeah.
For sure. That was the goal today. So I think we did a good job accomplishing that. Let us know, listeners, if you have any questions on conversions. We'd love to hear from you. info@srbadvisors.com. Dave, as always, it's been a pleasure, my friend.
It was fun. Talk to you later, Dick.
Thank you for joining us for another chat about your retirement and finances. Please hit that subscribe button. You can also contact us at srbadvisors.com or email us at info@srbadvisors.com. See you next time on Kitchen Table Finance.